Dr. Ravi Shankar from United States of America. Dr. Ravi Shankar has been one of us. Actually, he's an alumnus of PGI Chandigarh of Department of Pediatrics. He did his MBBS from JIPMER Pondicherry, which is another premier institute in India. And then he did his post-graduation, that is MD Pediatrics from PGI Chandigarh. After that, Dr. Ravi Shankar moved to United States of America and did his residency in New York, and then his fellowship in pediatric endocrinology from Indianapolis, US. Dr. Ravi Shankar has been faculty in the Indianapolis University, and later on, somewhere in 2007, he joined as clinical director and distinguished scientist at Merck in the field of endocrinology and metabolism with Merck, and he's continuing to occupy that position. So we are really looking for this opportunity to listen to Dr. Ravi Shankar, because he's really made it big in the pharma industry, and there would be several people who are connected to us today who would be interested in this type of a career. So welcome, Dr. Ravi Shankar, for the talk today. Please join us now.
Thank you, Meenu. Hopefully all of you can hear me. Just a small correction. I wouldn't say I've made it big in the industry, but I have lasted long enough here. So I just thought that I would take this opportunity to provide one view into how careers in the pharmaceutical industry for a physician will look like. I think it's time that this is considered as a career option for people who are in medicine, starting out, or midway through their career. There are a lot of opportunities and a lot of times in which these switches can be made. And I just thought that just giving a glimpse of how this works will help. I will start with how it worked for me to begin with. And as Dr. Meenu just said, I did start my MBBS training at JIPMER. So I would like to first start by thanking all of my mentors, starting with the faculty at JIPMER, at PGI, at SUNY Stony Brook, where I did a couple of years of PGY3 and Y4 residencies, and the Indiana University School of Medicine, where I did my fellowship, and now at Merck, where I continue to be mentored. So starting with my career at JIPMER, this is a group of faculty from the Department of Pediatrics that really inspired me to go into pediatrics, and actually gave me a lot of encouragement to move out of Pondicherry and look elsewhere, and that led me to PGI. And again, in PGI, although I only have the picture of the one and only Professor Walia, I have to tell you that it was his entire team that really nurtured all of us, including me. Pediatrics became not just a career, not just a job, but actually a sort of lifestyle, if you will. And that is thanks to everybody that sort of mentored us there, starting from Professor Walia to all of the senior residents, and that included Dr. Meenu at that time. So it was just a fantastic time there, after which I did my fellowship in pediatric endocrinology at the Indiana University School of Medicine, and this was a very interestingly designed fellowship. The American Board of Pediatrics required 1 year or 12 months of clinical service and 2 years or 24 months of research experience. So I spent my 2 years of research experience split into 6 months of real bench work in a lab, learning how to isolate DNA, RNA, how to synthesize cDNA, how to perform RT-PCR, etc. After which I switched to a different lab, which was involved with clinical research in the area of diabetes and vascular function, endothelial function to be very specific. And there was also some lab-based research in the sense that I learned to work with a lot of animal models, both rats and genetic mice models. This gave me a very good grounding in techniques such as euglycemic clamps, hyperglycemic clamps, biopsies of muscle and fat, performing indirect calorimetry, assessing endothelial function using, direct cannulations of the femoral vein, the technique of flow-mediated vasodilation, use of microbubbles to assess capillary circulation, etc. So this was my background when I started my post-fellowship academic position at the same institution at the Indiana University School of Medicine, where I was fortunate enough to have a position which was 75% research and 25% clinical. The clinical work focused mainly on type 2 diabetes in pediatric patients. I tried to combine my research and clinical interests into one sort of overarching area where I could set up studies to answer questions in pediatric patients with type 2 diabetes. So while this was going on, due to certain, because of some personal reasons, I had an opportunity to consider a move to pharma, and it was my move to Merck & Company, which was in New Jersey. So it not only meant a career move, it also meant moving geographical locations. So as my wife, who was also in the same position as I was, were considering this move. We looked into, what were the pros, what were the cons, and obviously the pros did win out, as you obviously know that I did make the choice to go to Merck. So the pros that we thought of was that this was an entirely different experience. Although we were both involved with clinical research, this was 100% clinical research in an entirely different setting. So that was something that was really exciting at that point. We also felt that whatever we did would benefit a much wider number of patients. Any indication that we worked on or anything that we did would affect a huge number of patients, as opposed to the small number that would be affected by our academic research. I'll come to this later, but that the large number of patients was obviously a benefit. We also felt that at that stage in our life, we did need more flexibility in our lifestyle, and this career allowed for some more flexibility than we had in our previous position. But it also obviously came with cons. The main cons was this loss of patient contact. We had trained in a system in India where the whole purpose of becoming a physician was to work to help patients. So this whole concept of moving to 100% research career actually meant a sort of frame shift in our thinking from just being a physician to being a physician scientist. In the United States, most physician scientists are MD PhDs, but we, sort of with our experience, were able to sort of work with MD PhDs as physician scientists quite successfully. So obviously, along with loss of patient contact, the other thing that was a significant loss for both of us was this opportunity to teaching medical students, teaching residents, teaching fellows. This was something that was a significant loss as far as we were concerned. It still is. But overall, we felt that the pros outweighed the cons, and we did make the change. So when we made the change, just before we made the change, what did I know about drug development? So my ideas can be summarized in a couple of slides. My ideas before I joined a pharma, I did not have a very good idea. So my thoughts were that, clinical observations would lead to ideas for therapeutic applications, and informed by the molecular biology of the disease and the biochemistry of both the disease and the intervention that you're thinking of, you can develop specific and targeted therapies. So this was my idea going in. But then as I went through the process of onboarding and learning how to do my job properly, I realized that this whole thing from concept to a marketed drug is a lot more complicated, has a lot more steps in there. But I'd like to broadly define these in two key stages. One is called drug discovery, which is all of the preclinical work, the work that goes on with chemistry, and the physical properties of the compound, et cetera. And then the development phase, which has both clinical and non-clinical aspects, particularly animal experiments, et cetera. So if you look at the strategy for drug discovery, it starts with understanding the molecular basis for disease, which then allows you to select a therapeutic target. And then this target is linked to a definitive mechanism. So, and this is very important because you need to know that this drug that you're developing actually engages the target, and it is actually making changes to the mechanism that you can actually identify. And then, this leads to the discovery and synthesis of chemicals or peptides these days, hopefully that is safe, effective, and obviously novel. So the synthesis of this, the chemistry involves the synthesis and the defining of the properties of these new compounds. Leads are derived from chemical observations, the molecular biology of the disease, and how the compound works in that process, using genomic and proteomic databases, and in vitro and in vivo properties that tell you whether this drug is worth pursuing or not. In this and succeeding slides, some of the asterisks represent these gates or milestones, which help us determine whether to continue down that path or to stop development, right there and cut our losses as it will be, as it were. And those milestones or gates are called the go, no go decision points. So this is one key go, no go decision point. And then, you continue to define toxicity in animals, and at least 2 species at very high doses. And it's a key no-go point. If it's toxic, you don't proceed any further. If it's carcinogenic, you don't proceed any further. And then you have to assess and see if this chemical is then amenable to be formulated in a way that can be administered for human use. So that, and again, it should be it should also lend itself to large scale synthesis in case the drug goes to the market. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to maintain the supply chain. So all of those things need to be assessed at this stage. So that then we move to the drug development stage, where the strategy is to now you define the disease, the target population, understand the natural history of the disease, and use the knowledge to develop and validate clinically meaningful endpoints, which will not only tell you whether the drug is efficacious or not, but these clinically validated endpoints typically are also accepted by regulatory authorities as appropriate markers for efficacy for registering the product. And you test the safety and efficacy in humans, and then you use strategies to make go, no go decisions along this process very efficiently. So starting with clinical pharmacology, one of the first studies in man will be introduction into humans to define the pharmacokinetics, the metabolism of the drug, which is abbreviated as ADME, the absorption, the distribution, the metabolism, and the elimination of the drug. Preliminary safety reads, again, a key no-go decision point, an opportunity to obtain preliminary pharmacodynamic data. For instance, if it's a drug that's going to be used in, say, patients with type 2 diabetes, then how does one dose change the glucose profile, which may or may not, you may or may not see it in a normal human being. So you may have to go into the disease population to actually see changes in the pharmacodynamic endpoint of interest. So the first study in humans is obviously, it's called phase 1. The principles that I'm going to present are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. These are very standard, very classic phases of drug development, but they may not apply to all therapeutic areas, to all therapeutic modalities, specifically oncology. It's very different there. I'm not going to go into it because that's a whole lecture in itself, but I just want to point out that these phases may not apply to all therapeutic areas and all therapeutic modalities. So phase 1 studies are generally relatively very small, and they are done in healthy volunteers, and these volunteers are treated for very short periods of time. Typically, it's mainly to establish pharmacokinetic profile, the metabolic profile, and the preliminary safety look. We try to use this opportunity to obtain pharmacodynamic data, but as I mentioned, there are caveats to that. So phase 1 studies, to summarize, are relatively small number of patients, healthy volunteers treated for a short period of time. And what you learn is pharmacokinetics, the bioavailability, and this is very important. We do a lot of these predictions based on animal data. This allows us to confirm that it is indeed correct. Our predictions using modeling and simulation methods are appropriate in the human patient. This is in human volunteers, but eventually in human patients. We assess effects on organs and tissues very extensively in these phase 1 studies, and ascending doses allow us to assess side effects as the doses are escalated, and biochemical surrogates or clinical readouts for efficacy are used fairly typically in many of these studies. So moving on to the next phase, you have to confirm the proof of principle or the efficacy in the target population. And again, if this is not there, you cannot proceed any further with that drug. You have to stop development. You have to determine optimal doses. An optimal dose is the lowest effective dose, and define the safety and efficacy profile of the drug as quickly as possible. And it requires multiple, carefully designed and properly executed clinical trials, and may require many further studies even after the drug has been approved. So the first study in patients with the disease of interest is obviously the phase 2 study, and phase 2A is to determine proof of principle, treatment periods of 2 to 12 months, approximately 100 to 300 patients, and they're typically placebo-controlled. Occasionally, active comparator might be a control group. Phase 2B is typically used to determine optimal doses. Several doses are tested in parallel, in a parallel group design, parallel arms for about, again, 2 to 12 months. The optimal dose will be the lowest dose yielding maximal efficacy, and this requires slightly larger number of patients, about 200 to 500. Now, at all times, we continue to collect safety data so that safety data is assessed in aggregate as all patients, the 300 patients in phase 1, in phase 2A, and then the 200 patients in phase 2B, they're all put together, and safety data are constantly assessed and used to make go, no-go decisions. What we end up at the end of phase 2 studies is learning whether this agent is effective in treating the disease, short-term side effects, the precision of the endpoints that we've chosen, and the optimal doses that will be taken into the next phase of the study. And that is phase 3, which are the registrational studies. These are required for approval by regulatory agencies across the world. Most require treatment for 6 to 24 months, and 2 replicate trials are generally required to confirm results prior to registration. And the total number of patients may go into the thousands, and the results establish the efficacy and safety profile of the drug. These findings appear in the physician's circular, in the patient's package insert, in marketing promotional materials. So these are very, very key and very pivotal studies. So again, the core efficacy and safety are determined from these phase 3 studies. Less common and longer term side effects come to rise up because you have a longer period of follow-up and you have way more patients. And all this information is put into the labeling or the package insert. Now, once a drug has been registered, there are studies that happen even after those phase 3 studies are completed. There are post-approval studies that are required as a condition of approval. A lot of the cardiovascular safety studies for agents used for type 2 diabetes are an example of studies that are conducted because they are required by agencies. These allow the companies to supplement their safety database because these are really large studies and they're very long-term studies. So they do allow for a very thorough investigation of not just the endpoint, the safety endpoint that the agencies are looking for, but also the overall safety profile is definitely assessed with these studies. And these are generally initiated shortly before or immediately after regulatory approval. And as I said, many thousands of patients are enrolled into these studies. Sometimes we perform studies after registration for our own purpose. These are not required by regulatory agencies. Some people call them phase 5 studies or phase 3B studies, depending on where you look at. These are typically used to broaden the indication for the use of a drug, like new indications or new populations not previously studied, and looking, for competition against the market, other drugs on the market. These could be conducted at any time. The sample size is typically determined by the study, meaning what is it that you're looking for and what is the number of patients you need to have the study powered adequately. So unlike the registrational studies where there are requirements for how many patients need to be exposed for how long, etc., these are determined by the sample size is determined by how you power the study. This is a very old slide. I've not been able to find anything new, but it sort of gives you an idea that, over 15, 20 years of development, starting with a compound and basic research, as a salt somewhere, if you will, to one drug that is actually launched. And as you can see, about anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 molecules are required for one drug to be approved at the end of so many years of research. So how is this research done? Again, this is something that I realized after I joined Merck. Clinical research is conducted in small teams, and these are in the core team consists of a clinical lead, a statistician, and clinical research support specialists. The clinical lead is where we come in as physicians. They're typically MDs. Very rarely PharmDs or PhDs are appointed to these positions. I'm not making these arrows and things on I'm not touching the slide, so I don't know where that's happening, but yeah, bear with me because I don't know how to stop it. Most of these clinical leads, they come from academia or they're recruited from other industries. Some people actually come from regulatory agencies. I'm seeing this more frequently now as a planned career path where individuals, after they finish their fellowship, actually work for the FDA or the EMA for somewhere between 3 and 5 years, and then join a pharmaceutical company. And they come in with a lot of regulatory experience, which is actually very invaluable. And that's a very, very nice path to take. It's rather new, but I think it's something that we'll see more of those kind of paths. Rarely people come in directly from clinical practice, but not that it's going to be different, but it will be different for them. I'm sorry. So from clinical practice to adjust to a completely research setting and get into this whole team situation, but people have done it, and it's not impossible. So it shouldn't be ruled out just because someone is in 100% clinical practice. Most of these individuals are very motivated. They're willing to work really hard. Many of them come in with a track record of scientific achievements, i.e. grants, a lot of publications, and have shown themselves to be innovative thinkers. They have very good communication skills, both written and verbal. This is very important because you do have to interact with agencies, and you need to be very fluent, and you need to be very clear and precise. So communication skills are very important. And this leadership abilities, although I have it here on the slide, it comes very naturally to most physicians because we are trained to be the leaders of whatever team that is providing clinical care to our patients. So it's fairly natural, and it's not very difficult to assume that particular role. And it's very important that we realize we're part of a team where, although we are the clinical lead, the other support functions provide very valuable input to what we do. So being a team player is very important. The research support, just for completion, these are usually people who have undergraduate or graduate degrees in the sciences. They work closely with us, the clinical teams, and as well as the study sites to optimize planning, implementation, and managing of the protocol. They also serve as representatives on cross-functional teams, and they do attend scientific meetings and educational training sessions. So it is, they do have opportunities for advancing in their careers. So I've talked about a team. So now let's talk about the settings in which these teams work in. One setting is the standard, you work either in phase 1 or in phase 3, and you help the teams take a drug to registration. So there's another branch in many companies. It's called by different names. It could be called translational medicine or experimental medicine, as I have on the slide over here. This is a very unique group. It may be a part of clinical pharmacology, or it may be independent. And their main job is to benchmark and build platforms. I'll come to what it means in just a second. And these help in making early decisions and early go, no goes, which allows us to either accelerate the program or say that this is not going to work and stop it. So what does platform building mean? Platform building means that you have a way of testing a compound to make sure that even with a single dose or just 2 or 3 doses, you can assess whether it's going to be useful or not. Benchmarking is, how do you tell how much of an effect, how much efficacy do you need to be competitive in the market space? So you take, for instance, an insulin sensitizer. You'd obviously benchmark it against pioglitazone because it's the only available insulin sensitizer on the market. So you can do clamps and assess pioglitazone and say, hey, pioglitazone produces X amount of improvement in insulin sensitivity. We want 30% more than that. And if it's not 30% more than that, we don't want to develop this product any further. Now that 30% or whatever the threshold is something that the team has to decide based on discussions with the commercial groups, based on the assessment of the market space, et cetera, et cetera. But once you make that decision, you can then very quickly run a study because the experimental medicine group will also come up with a platform to study it. So it could be a clamp study. It could be you do a clamp before and after administering pioglitazone. You know that pioglitazone one dose is not going to help. So you need 4 to 6 weeks of pioglitazone. So you can even study, at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks to see if you can have an early read even before the 6-week standard reads. So those are all the kind of things that experimental medicine does. It really comes closest to working in academic research. It's actually quite exciting. It can lead to a lot of innovative science and offers potential for collaboration with academia. This is the easiest place for innovative thinkers in academia to work with a pharmaceutical company is in platform building and in benchmarking. So the other areas that support clinical research, as I said, you have project management, because these are all huge studies and huge, amount of effort goes into getting them to run smoothly. You need somebody with regulatory affairs experience to help us negotiate the regulatory landscape. We need epidemiology to understand the natural history of the disease, to understand, they also help with patient-related outcomes, the development of good tools to assess patient-related outcomes. There are outcomes research groups, health economics groups, pharmacovigilance groups. These are all places where physicians do find place, and they do contribute quite significantly in there. So for instance, in epidemiology, most of the leads are PhDs in epidemiology, but I have worked with several MDs who have had additional training in epidemiology who do a fantastic job in this area. They help us define the patient population, they help us validate endpoints, and they help define the disease incidence and prevalence to see what sort of impact treatment will make in this particular area. Outcomes research, health economics is a new space. Occasionally, MDs with special training shine really well in this. A lot of people in the health economics fields are math whizzes. They come up with beautiful models, and sometimes it's amazing how beautifully they work it out. The biggest thing that I find this group to be very useful is in the design of studies to evaluate cost effectiveness of new medical interventions, comparative efficacy studies, and then developing data regarding long-term outcomes and the economic impact of the disease of interest. So these are all support things that help inform the clinical team how to proceed, where to go, and what to use as outcome measures, endpoints, etc. And as I already mentioned, regulatory affairs is very important to navigate the regulatory landscape. These are mainly MDs, occasionally PhDs in biological sciences. They provide key input to ensure that clinical trial designs will meet regulatory requirements, and they liaise with all the regulatory agencies like the FDA in the US and other agencies worldwide, and they coordinate with the regulatory strategies in countries and other areas to ensure that the studies that we do, a single group of studies, will be sufficient to get approval in multiple geographical areas. This is another area where a lot of MDs work in. So far, I've talked about people who are inward facing. They face the company. This is the group that faces outwards. They face the physicians who prescribe the drugs. These are people who work as the bridge between the clinical research group inside the company and the healthcare providers or HCPs outside the company. They allow for bi-directional exchange of ideas with healthcare providers, and they occasionally help with the design and conduct of post-marketing clinical trials. A lot of MDs work in the medical affairs area. It's actually a very easy area for MDs to sort of transition into, and because they understand the clinical studies and the results, and they're able to interpret it for the healthcare providers. Pharmacovigilance, again, is something that this is actually a very new, I wouldn't say very new, it's an upcoming area. They conduct aggregate safety monitoring to look for first-line signal detection. They represent the company in external discussions to shape global regulatory and safety science. They lead a lot of pharmacovigilance processes, both within the company and intercompany groups. And they actually serve as subject matter experts when we are inspected by regulatory agencies. And they participate in a lot of external benchmarking and industry working groups to come up with standards across the industry. So the other areas that MDs work in labs, like I said, there are a lot of MD PhDs. They can work in clinical operations and in marketing as well. This is not so frequent. I haven't seen too many of them, but there are some who have done extremely well in these roles as well. So the similarities to academia are that it is a very simulating scientific environment. There's a lot of science being discussed. It's not just the health economics that is being discussed. There is a very formal and peer-reviewed process for every protocol that is written. It is thoroughly and exhaustively reviewed, there's opportunities to work with several thought leaders across the world. And after science, time is the major driver of activity in these companies, and the work is highly collaborative, and it's actually very very nice to from those aspects. We do advance the frontiers of medicine. We publish a lot. There is a requirement to publish even negative trials. So we add to the scientific literature. But then there are some differences from academia, and this we need to talk about. The flexibility in work focus is required. Compounds may be maturing one day and maybe dead the next day. Therapeutic targets will be changed. Fungibility is a word that I learned when I came to industry. It means that, as a pediatric endocrinologist, I should be able to work in oncology if necessary. Generally, there are no resource constraints, so you don't have to. It's not like you have to desperately pray for that grant to come through for you to conduct that research project. But patient care is not required, but it's possible. You can do patient care, and of course, there's also this perceived lack of independence where everybody thinks that you just have to do what the company requires you to do. Well, that's actually quite true of many other aspects of physician practice these days, not just in a pharmaceutical company. So I talked about the different types of publications. Well, these are all examples of Merck studies that were published. The results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. These are some of the studies that I've been involved in that have been published in various journals. Including diabetes care, several, I had the opportunity to work with an NIH working group. So it's basically the opportunities of what you create and how you work to make it happen. So I said I'll come back to this transition from academia to pharma, or practice to pharma. So if this is basically how you look at patient contact, if you're 100% clinical, it's 100% patient contact. If you're in academic research, it goes down proportionate to how much of your time is funded by research. If you're in pharma, it's close to zero. but then how do you, I mean, what's the other end of the spectrum, which is the impact, the number of patients that you impact? Well, if you're in clinical practice, you impact only the group of patients that you treat. If you're in academic research, that impact expands a little bit more because what you do can be adopted by other people. In pharmaceutical research, whether it's a new drug that you bring to a market or a new indication for an established drug, the number of people who start to use it increases. So your impact goes up. So it's, you trade one for the other, and you just have to make the decision what is important for you. So I'd like to end with, why consider industry as an option? You have the opportunity to do challenging research. There is a very ample opportunity for scientific publication, scientific recognition. You minimize efforts towards grant writing and desperately praying that the grant agencies and the gods grant you the funding. And I do think that career productivity and advancement gets maximized. So how do you do this? Subspecialty training, in my opinion, is actually very valuable. Additional degrees like MPH and PhDs, not necessary, but I wouldn't say no, but I don't think it's absolutely required. Basic lab or clinical experience and prior research experience is really not required. If you have some, it sort of makes the transition that much faster. But before you do any of these, you might want to consider working as or for a clinical trial investigator to see if this kind of thing is something that you are interested in. Consider a rotation like a summer internship in industry. Dr. Meenu was just telling me about NIPER and its opportunities in Chandigarh. So for people in Chandigarh, that's something to consider, to see if NIPER can offer some sort of course or workshop that will allow you to understand what pharma and drug development looks like and whether it's for you or not. And then, of course, the most important thing, networking. Network. There's no question that's bad. The only question that's bad is the one that you don't ask. So, ask, and you will be able to understand how to make this happen. I think that was my last slide. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ravi Shankar, for that illuminating talk, actually opening the vistas of pharma for clinicians as well as for academicians and scientists.
I
and
see
you
some questions here, right?
various processes, how are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So thank you for outlining the various processes involved in drug development as well as drug or molecular testing, for example, various randomized controlled trials. And recently, actually, systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials have become very important in guiding about, policies and also about which drugs to adopt and what to conduct on those molecules. That is something we are connected with in our ICMR Advanced Center for Evidence-Based Child Health. And you've also told us how and what are the qualities of a person who would like to move into pharma, and you have really shown us by example, by your own example, how you have excelled in this particular field. And I'm really impressed with the kind of publications which you could have, while being involved in pharma research. So we have some questions in the chat box. One was, actually I missed out a little bit in between because I had to reconnect because of the internet problem. So if I've missed out any questions, they will, I think Amit can ask those questions from telemedicine. But the first one is by Dr. Gautam Misha, and she's asking how clinical studies are helpful in creating evidence regarding health and disease. I think you have taken up these questions, but would you like to elaborate again?
Yeah, sure. So even if so as just to step back, we publish results of all the studies that we do, even if they are not positive. And what that does allow you is to build up a body of evidence about what works in this particular kind of in this disease, what kind of agents are appropriate, and why, and then that leads to the next question: why certain agents work in the condition whereas others don't, or if they work in the adults with the same disease, why they don't work in kids. What is the difference between a pediatric patient with, the example that I know that's dear to my heart, type 2 diabetes versus adults with type 2 diabetes. So these are all the kind of things that can be sparked from these kind of studies and these kind of publications. And that's basically, even if that's not the primary role of what we are doing, when we publish these results, that is exactly what ends up happening. We add to the scientific literature, which can then be synthesized, and people can go out and ask more questions, design more studies to try and understand it better.
There was a question from telemedicine as to what's the role of telemedicine in pharma, and what are the opportunities for telemedicine people?
So I don't know if there is a direct role of telemedicine in pharma, but having said that, there's a lot of virtual, how shall I say, interactions, both scientific, scientific community or with the healthcare professionals. Particularly now, this pandemic has really, brought that thing to the forefront. So people with the wherewithal to conduct these kind of online platforms, they're actually very well thought of. I had to say that, when I first started doing this last March, it took me a few weeks to figure out how to do this properly. Even now, I'm not very sure. Dr. Meenu will confirm that, and Amit will confirm that I logged in early to make sure that I was able to share my slides, because these are not things that come very easy. So people who have these skills definitely do have a role, but not exactly with telemedicine. That may not be something that pharma might be able to do. Having said that, I think that there is a version of clinical trials which are called virtual clinical trials. So it is something that we're all just learning about how to do it. Things like, how do we get electronic informed consent? How do you collect data from patients electronically while maintaining patient privacy? So those are all things that are going to be really big in the future. So people who are good with this kind of technology and are able to adapt very quickly, those will be areas where I can see them becoming more and more useful. Certainly, it won't be people like me, because it's way beyond what we can do. But it requires a certain degree of digital experience. There's another question on evidence-based medicine, right?
Yes.
Right. So again, while what we do is not directly, for evidence-based medicine, when we publish these results, that's exactly what we hope will happen. That people will use all of this to create evidence-based strategies, to create practice guidelines, to create protocols for use in clinical practice based on the results that have been that we publish. Obviously, that should not be the only information that's used. There are a lot of real-world evidence studies and evidence and results from real-world evidence studies that need to go into this picture, because you need to know how exactly will what we found in clinical trials, how does it translate into the real world? So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is how do you interpret a clinical trial, any paper that's published, to use it for evidence base? You need to look at the inclusion exclusion criteria. You need to see if the kind of patients that were included in that study were the kind of patients that you see. So, if it's all in white males, it may not be applicable to the Indian population. On the other hand, if it's a study that has 20, 30%, Asians, and we don't see any difference in subgroup analyses, then it's likely that the main results are likely to be translated. So you'll have to generate these evidence-based strategies for yourself based on the studies that are published. But what we publish will add to the corpus of evidence that can be used. So
Yes,
there's
sir.
another question.
One of the technologies, yes, it's about the licensing exam, whether something like USMLE is required for transition into pharma for Indian physicians.
So again, I have to confess that I'm assuming that is for transitioning into pharmaceutical companies based in the United States or outside of India. So while it's not necessary, it would be useful because without a USMLE, you will not be able to obtain specialty or subspecialty training in the United States, which is considered to be, which I think is very useful to get into a position where you're doing something that is exciting. I know of several physicians from India who have chosen not to go the USMLE route, who end up working for pharmaceutical companies in support positions. They very rarely are able to take up a lead, the clinical lead in the clinical team. So they work as clinical research support people. They work in the operations groups and things like that. But if you really want to be a clinical lead, and if you want to be designing protocols, executing protocols, monitoring protocols, and then eventually writing up these and publishing them, you need to be a clinical lead. And for that, you need to be trained in the United States for a US-based company. But there are so many Indian-based pharmaceutical companies with very similar roles. And so I don't think that has been adequately explored at this time.
So are there any more questions by the participants? Dr. Amit, can you check on YouTube if there are any comments or questions?
No, ma'am, there is no question on YouTube.
Okay, there's no question on YouTube. So thank you very much, Ravi, for such a wonderful talk and an interaction with all the researchers. Many of the participants have actually complimented you on your wonderful talk. And thank you very much. And you did mention about starting some kind of a course or a teaching session for people to further understand what are the nuances of becoming a pharma specialist in the US. So if you want to do that sometimes, I think we can, interact about this and maybe have a common platform on which we can organize some kind of for researchers, especially for pharmacological. We have a very active department of clinical pharmacology here, who are very closely collaborating with us on evidence-based medicine. And with them, I think we can organize a session for the residents there who are doing their DM clinical pharmacology, and many of them do move out into industry. And also for other people who might be interested in, doing their bit in the pharma industry and contribute to drug development and give ideas for future drug development. As you know, India has a very rich heritage of phytochemicals, or what we know as Ayurveda. So, and a lot of our institutions are trying to set up centers for trials for Ayurvedic medicine. And it's also the basic molecules and how they are combined and how they're used in combination with rest of the plant, product. That is something which is a matter of a lot of discussion these days. Do you have any opinion on this?
Ma'am, there are two questions on YouTube also regarding.
First, let him answer the question which I have asked, and then you pose the question.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, Meenu, I was going to say, could you just repeat what you said, or Amit, can you repeat it for me, because Dr. Meenu is cutting in and out for me.
I think I'll use my other phone for asking you. This is oh, sorry. Amit, please ask questions from the YouTube.
Okay, ma'am. So, sir, there is a question that is there any way or processes to continue both the clinical practice and industry work simultaneously for a pharmaceutical physician?
So you cannot work hold two jobs. At least I don't think it's not possible in the United States. Yeah, if you work for a pharmaceutical company, you have to work for them full time. You cannot hold another job. The only way we see patients is half a day every week. We're allowed to do patient care without taking any remuneration. So we cannot charge for that, for those patients, or charge for our time. We just do it as a pro bono sort of service. But I think similar restrictions will apply in India. What you can do as a full-time clinician is to work as an investigator on clinical trials with a pharmaceutical company. A lot of our investigator sites are full-time clinicians who are trained in research practices and in the use of our database and reporting requirements, etc. And that's how they liaise with us, but they are not employees of the pharmaceutical company.
So, sir, second question, actually, I don't think that it's related to you. It's like that, how can anyone can learn systematic review and meta-analysis on online basis within an economic course fee structure?
Unfortunately, no, I don't have information on that.
I think that kind of question we can address in some of our courses. But, I wanted to ask you, there is a question there. How about, what's your view on becoming a teacher in pharmaceutical sciences, rather than going into a industry scenario?
So, like in a university, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that is an option. To me, it's not as exciting as what I do. It may not be, I mean, there are times when I have to work for prolonged periods of time. There are times when, you hear back from the agencies and it's not what you want to hear. But regardless, it's what I do is something that's very exciting. I wake up excited. It's a very challenging situation I find myself in terms of intellectual stimulation. So for me, there's really no comparison, but it depends. I mean, if somebody is very good at teaching, they would probably be able to do that very well. There are several courses that from universities that actually prepare people to teach these kind of courses. So it's probably not a bad thing for some people to do. It depends on your personality, I would say.
Right. So the question which I asked earlier was about, what is your opinion about research into Ayurvedic medicine on a similar platform as is done for other chemicals which are produced? Because in India, at the moment, there is a lot of discussion about, how to put Ayurvedic medicine on an equal footing and to conduct randomized control trials, etc. on them. What is your view on this?
So I would say that would be extremely welcome if someone can take the initiative and perform these assessments, starting with walk up products through the phases of allopathic drug development, if you will. So that would be the first one, and you establish efficacy and you show that it's safe. That's phenomenal. The second thing that needs to happen, and that's part of a pharmaceutical company, is how is the product supplied, so that every single pill has the same amount of the active substance. It doesn't vary beyond a percentage that's approved by the regulatory agency. How the manufacturing is done in a very clean, very responsible manner. Those are all kind of things that also need to be part of developing Ayurvedic medications, because it's not just to show that the medicine is effective and safe, it also has to be consistent. So you need to have some sort of way to establish that if you are giving one tablet of whatever it is that you're giving, it contains the same amount of the active ingredient across different batches of that product. So if that were to happen, I think it's phenomenal. I think it's a great opportunity, and looking through what's happening, and I agree with you, it's probably a great place to start, and a very good place to be funded appropriately in this day and age in India, for sure.
Yes, thank you. One of the main impediments in pharmaceutical and, like, say, industry academia interaction or interface is conflict of interest, which is supposed to be there. And even if people declare the conflict of interest, they still have it. And in India, of course, it's a major problem. So how do you take care of this in US?
So I have to say that my experience is rather limited. We actually have a separate legal department that drafts all those contracts. So my job, to be very honest, is to identify who I want to collaborate with, and I turf it to somebody else who then decides how that collaboration happens, what kind of contracts need to be signed, what kind of disclosures have to be signed, et cetera. So to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that when I was at the Indiana University, and when I did collaborate with some of the pharmaceutical companies at that time, the university got into very serious discussions with respect to what is intellectual property, who owns it, and how how it can be used, et cetera. And that's typically the bone of contention in these contracts. But to be very honest, I don't know how it gets resolved, and how the final negotiations and compromises occur. No, I don't know that. It's done through a set of specialized lawyers.
Right. Okay. One last question is, please highlight about fellowships available after MD Pharmacology in India and abroad. In India, of course, we have DM Clinical Pharmacology with the courses there in Chandigarh, PGI, also in All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Could you highlight about there are fellowship courses in US also. Could you highlight some of them?
So there are fellowships in clinical pharmacology. 3-year fellowships in clinical pharmacology, which a lot of people do. The way those fellowships are structured, they allow a lot of interaction with industry. And many of the graduates of those fellowships do end up working either for industry, or sometimes they actually work for a regulatory agency before they go to industry and gain that advantage as well. So yes, so it's the same thing. The clinical pharmacology fellowship is probably what would be the best. In the US, you can actually piggyback clinical pharmacology fellowships onto other fellowships as well. For instance, my wife did a combined fellowship in clinical pharmacology and endocrinology together. You can blend it together. So those options also exist in terms of flexibility.
I think that's the kind of opportunity which is available only in the United States of America. And that's something which is really instructive, and it's something really innovative, I think, combine things.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we have run into a lot of overtime for you, Ravi. Are you okay? I hope.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't have,
time.
I mean, it's 9:30, 9:36 in the evening, so I don't have anything to do. So I'm fine with time. So.
Oh, yes. So any last minute messages for people in India?
So the one thing that I want to say is that a lot of people think that, oh, this is something that I'm not going to be able to do. So I just want to tell people that as physicians, all of you are amazing. I mean, you synthesize patient data in a few minutes, you put it together, and you come up with treatment plans and things like that. So those are all abilities that you really need to give yourself credit for, and that you can use in any situation. So I, for one, really think that that physicians can do anything. They just have to overcome their inertia. So that would be my biggest advice to resident fellows, or even other people in other levels of their careers, is that you just have to overcome your inertia. Do not second guess yourself. Do not think that you don't have the skill set. And you have the building blocks. It'll take you very little time to get up to speed. So you just have to give yourself that push to take the plunge. That would be my parting thought.
So thank you very much. I would pass on your message to Professor Walia, as well as to Dr. Srinivas, who's actually still a very active part of our discussion groups. And I'm sure he would have participated, he would have listened to you on the YouTube. And thank you very much for joining today. We are hoping to have you again sometimes for a similar interaction. Thank you so much.
Definitely, and I certainly am looking forward to the discussion with Chitra on the 17th.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Sir.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amit, and all
Bye.
the staff of telemedicine. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.